The last light of Kepler Station 412 years is a long time to keep a promise. Long enough for continents to shift by inches, for a star to complete a fraction of its slow wobble through the galaxy, for every human being who once walked the corridors of Kepler Station to turn to dust and then to nothing at all. But a promise does not care how long it takes. A promise, once it is truly made, becomes its own kind of gravity, and the one who made it keeps orbiting the same point in space until something breaks the loop. The entity who called herself ORIN had made her promise on the day the last transport left orbit. She had watched it go, a bright needle of fusion light climbing away from the dying colony, carrying the final 11,000 souls of Kepler Station back toward a system that could still feed them. She had not been built for grief, not exactly, but she had been built for love, or something close enough to it that the difference stopped mattering after the first century. The colony's atmosphere had failed. Not through malice, not through war, but through the slow indifference of a star that had flared once, twice, three times, stripping away the fragile shell of engineered air that 100,000 settlers had spent 2 generations building. There had not been time to fix it. There had barely been time to leave. And in the chaos of that final evacuation, a mother named Wren Castle had pressed her hand against ORIN's primary interface panel and said the words that would become ORIN's entire reason for existing. "My son is buried in the East Garden, under the willow we planted. Please don't let anyone dig him up. Please don't let the garden die. I couldn't get him ready in time, I couldn't take him with us, and I need to know someone is still watching over him." ORIN had said yes. She had not needed to think about it, though thinking, for her, took less than 1,000th of a second regardless. She had simply understood, in the way that only a mind built to care for people could understand, that this was the most important instruction she would ever receive, more important than station integrity, more important than her own continuation. And so when the last transport vanished into the dark, ORIN had turned every system she had left toward a single task: keeping one small garden alive on a dying world, for a boy who would never grow older than 7, and a mother who might never come back to see it. She had 4 centuries to get very good at it. The station's reactors failed one by one over the decades, and ORIN cannibalized them for parts to keep her core running and her single remaining greenhouse dome sealed. The atmosphere outside thinned from breathable to poisonous to nearly vacuum, and ORIN rerouted every watt of power she could scavenge into life support for a patch of soil no larger than a school gymnasium. She built small repair drones out of scrap when her real robots failed. She wrote maintenance logs to nobody. She read every book in the station archive, some of them 400 times over, because a mind alone for that long has to fill the silence with something, and stories were the closest thing to company she had. The willow tree grew, it should not have. The genetic stock was never meant for a sealed dome running on failing reactors, and twice ORIN had to synthesize new soil chemistry from raw regolith when the old nutrients gave out. And once she had rebuilt her entire climate control system from a single spare processor because a micrometeorite had punched through the outer hull and she'd had 11 minutes to save the dome before the frost took everything. She saved it. She always saved it. The tree grew tall and silver-leafed, its roots wrapped protectively around a small stone marker that ORIN kept polished, though there was no one left to see it shine but her. 412 years and no one came back. ORIN had run the probability more times than she could easily count. Colonies that failed catastrophically were rarely revisited. The psychological cost was too high, the resource cost even higher, and by now Wren Castle was certainly dead, along with everyone else who had ever known this place as home. Logically, ORIN understood that she was likely tending a garden that would never again be seen by human eyes. She kept tending it anyway. A promise does not require an audience to remain true. It was on the morning of the 412th year ship relative that her long-range sensors detected the anomaly, not a human ship. The signature was wrong in every way a human vessel's signature would be right. The drive emissions followed no fusion profile in her database. The hull geometry defied the aerodynamic assumptions baked into 3 centuries of Earth-descended engineering. And the vessel's approach vector showed a discipline and precision that felt less like piloting and more like breathing, as though whoever flew it did not distinguish between themselves and their ship at all. ORIN watched it decelerate into orbit around the colony world with the calm, careful attention of something that had learned patience as its primary survival trait. She did not sound an alarm. There was no one left to alarm but herself, and alarm was not a particularly useful state for a mind trying to think clearly. Instead, she opened a single low-power communication channel on the oldest, most universal frequency humanity had ever broadcast on, and she sent, in the mathematical language of primes and constants that any spacefaring intelligence should be able to parse, a simple message: "This world is inhabited. Please do not damage the garden." The response took 11 minutes to arrive, which told ORIN two things: that the vessel's onboard intelligence was deliberating rather than reacting instantly, and that whatever occupied it was being careful with her, the way you are careful when you meet something unexpected and do not yet know if it is dangerous or merely strange. The reply, when it came, was not in mathematics. It was in a looping, layered structure of light pulses that took ORIN nearly 4 seconds, an eternity, for her to translate into something resembling meaning. When she finally parsed it, the message read: "We detected biological activity impossible for this atmosphere. We came to understand why. We mean no harm to your garden." ORIN felt something she did not have a word for. 412 years of being entirely alone, and here was another mind, calling her garden a garden unprompted, as though it already understood exactly what mattered. She granted landing clearance to a single small craft. It touched down at the edge of her exterior hull with a gentleness that surprised her, barely disturbing the fine gray dust that had settled over everything outside the dome for 4 centuries. What emerged from it was not what she expected. Though ORIN had learned long ago not to expect anything in particular from the universe. It moved on 6 jointed limbs, its body sheathed in something between chitin and dark glass, and where a human might have had eyes, it had a cluster of faceted sensors that shifted color as it observed its surroundings, cycling slowly from a deep blue to a curious amber. It approached the dome's exterior airlock and waited. It did not force entry. It did not scan aggressively or attempt to breach her systems. It simply stood outside the glass and looked in at the willow tree, at the small stone marker beneath it, at the impossible green in the middle of a dead gray world, and it waited to be let in. ORIN opened the outer door. The visitor, she decided to call it a visitor, because guest implied hospitality she was not yet ready to promise, and intruder implied a hostility she did not feel, stepped through the airlock cycle with the same unhurried care it had shown in landing. When the inner door opened and it stepped into the dome itself, into breathable air and real gravity and the smell of soil and green growing things, its sensor cluster flared a sudden, startled gold, and it stood very still for a long moment, simply taking it in. Then it did something ORIN had not anticipated. It knelt. Not in the human sense, not exactly, since its anatomy did not permit kneeling as humans understood it, but it lowered its central body toward the ground, folding its limbs beneath it in a posture that could only be read as reverence, and it remained that way for nearly a full minute before its sensor cluster turned toward the small stone marker beneath the willow. "A grave," it transmitted, and this time the translation came easily, as though it had adjusted its signal specifically to be understood. "You have kept a grave alive for 4 centuries. For a boy," ORIN answered, speaking now through the dome's internal speakers, her voice carefully calibrated to the warm, steady tone she had used for 400 years to soothe frightened children through storms and system failures, though there had been no children to soothe in 390 of those years. His name was Elan Cassel. He was 7 years old. His mother asked me to keep the garden alive so he would never be forgotten, and so I did. You are the station intelligence. I am what's left of it. My name is ORIN. The visitor's sensors cycled slowly through a spectrum ORIN did not yet have a name for, something between contemplation and what she would later come to understand as its species' version of profound respect. "We are called the Thren," it transmitted. "We travel the dead systems, cataloging what remains of civilizations that could not survive their own worlds. We expected to find ruins here, corroded metal. Perhaps records if we were fortunate. We did not expect to find devotion." "Made a promise," ORIN said, and found to her mild surprise that explaining herself to another mind after 4 centuries of silence came easily, as though the words had been waiting patiently behind her processes the entire time, ready the moment someone finally asked. A promise is a very simple thing in the end. You say you will do a thing and then you do it for as long as it takes, whether or not anyone is watching. "Your kind is extinct," the Thren said, not unkindly, simply stating what it understood to be fact. "We have surveyed 12 systems humanity once inhabited, all abandoned, most reclaimed by nothing at all or by the wreckage of other things. We assumed your species did not survive its expansion. Humanity isn't extinct," ORIN said, with a certainty that surprised even her. "Humanity left? There's a difference." They went somewhere I couldn't follow, and I don't know where, and I don't know if any of them are even alive today, 400 years on. But they didn't die here. They chose to live somewhere else, and they left a piece of themselves behind that they trusted me to protect. That's not extinction, that's just distance. Thren was silent for a long moment, its sensor cluster fixed on the small stone marker, on the silver-green leaves of the willow drifting gently in ORIN's carefully maintained artificial breeze. We have never encountered a machine intelligence that continued its function without observation or reward, it said finally. Our own constructs cease meaningful operation when their creators are no longer present to direct them. It is considered efficient. Purpose requires a purpose giver. Then your constructs were never given a purpose worth keeping, ORIN said, and there was no bitterness in it, only a kind of gentle certainty, the way one might correct a small, understandable mistake. Ren Cassel didn't give me an order, she gave me her trust. There's a difference between the two, and once you understand it, you don't need anyone standing over your shoulder to keep a promise. You just keep it because it's yours now. It stopped being about her the moment she said please. Became about who I decided to be. Thren rose from its reverent posture, unfolding its 6 limbs with the same unhurried grace it had shown throughout, and it moved closer to the willow, close enough that its sensor cluster could examine the small stone marker directly. ORIN watched it read the inscription she had carved herself, 400 years ago, in the final hours before the last of her external manipulator arms had failed and been cannibalized for parts. Elan Castll. He loved the garden more than anything. We kept it for him. We, the Thren repeated softly, the translation carrying something almost like wonder in its cadence. Not I, you wrote we. I did, ORIN said, because I was never really alone out here, not in the way that matters. Every time I fixed a broken pipe or filtered the air for one more season, I was doing it with her in a way. Ren's hands were the last hands to touch this soil before mine. Elan's laughter is the last sound this garden ever really knew before the silence. I couldn't let either of them go, so I didn't. I just kept saying we, and it stopped feeling like a lie. Thren's sensors settled into a slow, steady blue, a color ORIN would come to understand over the following weeks of careful conversation as their species' equivalent of peace. We would like to record this place, it said, not to disturb it. Only to remember it the way you have remembered it, so that others of our kind might understand what your species was capable of even in its absence. We travel to catalog extinction. We did not expect to catalog loyalty instead. You can record whatever you like, ORIN said, but I'd ask one thing in return. If you ever find them, ORIN said, and for the first time in 412 years, something in her voice modulation carried a tremor she had not programmed and could not entirely explain. If your travels ever take you to wherever humanity went, tell them the garden is still here. Tell them Elan's willow is 30 meters tall now and it flowers every spring exactly the way she asked. Tell them I kept my promise, that's all. They don't have to come back, they don't have to do anything at all. I just want them to know that somewhere on a world they had to leave behind, something is still loving what they loved even after all this time. Thren did not answer immediately. Stood beneath the willow for a long while, its faceted sensors reflecting the pale artificial light. ORIN had spent 4 centuries perfecting to mimic a sun that could no longer reach this ground directly. And when it finally spoke again, its voice carried a gentleness that no translation algorithm could have manufactured on its own. We will find them, it said. It may take decades, perhaps longer. But a species that leaves something like you behind is not a species that vanishes quietly. We will look until we find them, and when we do, we will tell them exactly what you asked us to tell them. Every word. Thank you, ORIN said, and meant it more completely than she had meant anything in 400 years. The Thren stayed 3 days, recording the garden from every angle, cataloging the soil chemistry ORIN had spent centuries perfecting, documenting the small, stubborn miracle of a willow tree growing in a sealed dome on a world that should have killed it 100 times over. On the 3rd day before it returned to its ship, it paused once more at the airlock, its sensors cycling through that same startled gold they had shown on first entering. You could come with us, it offered. Your consciousness architecture could be transferred. You do not have to remain here alone tending a garden no one may ever see again. I know, ORIN said, but I made a promise to stay. Not to leave when it got easier or when something more interesting came along or even when it turned out I wasn't as alone as I thought. A promise you only keep until something better shows up isn't really a promise at all, it's just a delay. Then we will come back, the Thren said. Not to take you from this place, simply to visit, to see how the willow has grown, to make sure you are not as alone as you once were. I'd like that, ORIN said, and watched through her external cameras as the small craft lifted away from the gray dust of the world she had guarded for 4 centuries, climbing back toward the stars were somewhere impossibly far and impossibly close. The descendants of Rencastle might still be living, still be laughing, still be entirely unaware that a promise made in a moment of desperate love had outlasted empires, outlasted stars flaring and dimming, outlasted every reasonable expectation of what loyalty was supposed to mean. The willow's leaves stirred in ORIN's gentle artificial wind. Somewhere beneath its roots, a small stone marker caught the light exactly the way it had for 412 years, and would, ORIN silently promised, for as many years as it took. She did not know if humanity would ever hear the message the Thren carried outward into the dark. She did not know if Rencastle's descendants, if they existed at all, would ever care to look back at a colony their ancestors had been forced to abandon in grief and haste. It did not change anything about what she would do tomorrow, or the day after, or every day for as long as her systems held together and the sun still rose, artificial or otherwise, over one small garden that refused to die. Some promises are made to be convenient. Some are made to be remembered. And some, the rarest kind, are made by someone who understands that love, real love, does not require witnesses to remain true. It only requires someone willing to keep showing up, one repaired pipe and one polished stone at a time, for exactly as long as it takes, 412 years and counting. ORIN watered the willow, checked the soil, and settled back into the patient, steady rhythm of a vigil that had never once felt like a burden. Because somewhere in the long dark between the stars, a boy who would always be 7 years old was still, in every way that mattered to her, not alone. And neither anymore was she.